This is my true story. I never thought I'd see the day when my own daughter would leave me lying in a hospital bed for nearly a week without a single visit. 6 days of waiting, hoping she'd walk through the door. But she never came. I raised her through poverty, gave her everything, helped raise her own children, and yet, when I needed her most, I was alone. What I did next changed everything she thought she would inherit. But before I tell you what I did which shocked her, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I was not born into comfort. My life began in a small, drafty house with more cracks in the walls than coins in my pocket. I married young, not because life was easy, but because love gave me courage. My husband and I had dreams, small ones, like owning a car that wouldn't break down every month, or a home with a roof that didn't leak every time it rained. But life had its own plans. When my daughter was just 12, my husband passed away suddenly. No warning, no time to prepare. 1 minute, he was here. The next, I was standing in the hospital, holding my daughter's hand, trying to be strong for her while my own world collapsed inside me. From that day on, it was just me and her. I worked any job I could find. In the mornings, I scrubbed floors at the school she attended. In the evenings, I worked at the diner down the road, wiping tables and pouring coffee for people who didn't even know my name. Some nights, when money was tight, I skipped dinner so she could have a little extra on her plate. I patched her clothes instead of buying new ones. When winter came, I made sure she had the warmest coat, even if it meant I wore mine until the lining was torn and the buttons hung loose. I remember her little voice saying, "One day, I'll take care of you, Mama." I believed her. Every decision I made was for her future. When she said she wanted to go to university, I took on extra shifts. I stayed up late ironing clothes for neighbors, sewing curtains, cleaning houses, anything that paid. I sent her off to college with a full suitcase and enough money to pay for her first term, even though I knew it meant I would have to eat beans on toast for weeks. I never once complained. I never kept score. When she got married, I was there with a smile on my face, hiding the fact that I had sold my jewelry, my wedding ring included, to help pay for the reception she dreamed of. I bought her the white dress she wanted, the one she thought was too expensive, and told her not to worry about it. She never knew what it cost me, and I didn't tell her. Love doesn't keep receipts. Then came the grandchildren. Oh, those children became the light of my life. I was the one who babysat when she needed to work late, the one who picked them up from school, the one who stayed up all night when one of them had a fever. I cooked Sunday dinners for everyone, made birthday cakes from scratch, and sewed costumes for school plays. I gave them my time, my energy, my heart. I thought that bond, the one between a mother and daughter, between a grandmother and her grandchildren, was something no one could break. But looking back, I realize I was slowly becoming invisible. My role was always to give, never to receive. When she needed help, I was there. When I needed anything, I told myself, "Don't bother her, she's busy." I thought it was love. I thought I was being selfless. I didn't see the slow drift, the way her visits became shorter, the way her thank yous faded into silence. Through all the years, I believed we were unshakable. I believed the sacrifices I made were an investment in a relationship that would last a lifetime. I believed, with all my heart, that she would be there for me in my old age, not out of duty, but out of love. I was wrong. It didn't happen all at once. Coldness rarely does. It creeps in quietly, like a draft under the door. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Life just gets busy, right? People have jobs, children, responsibilities. I made excuses for her because that's what mothers do. But deep down, I felt the shift. After her remarriage, things changed more than I wanted to admit. Her new husband was polite, but there was always a wall there, an invisible one, but solid enough that I could feel it every time I walked into their home. I noticed the little things first. She stopped calling me just to chat. Our conversations became short and functional, like she was ticking off a task on a list. "Hi, Mom, just checking in." And before I could say more than a few sentences, she was already saying, "Okay, I've got to go." I didn't mind the quick calls at first, but soon they became rare. Weeks would pass without a word. I would sit by the phone some evenings, telling myself I wasn't waiting for her call, but I was. I would glance at the clock and think, maybe after dinner she'll call. The phone stayed silent, and when I finally did hear from her, it was almost always because she needed something. "Can you babysit on Saturday? Can you loan me a little to cover the car repair until next week?" I always said yes, no matter how tired I was, no matter how much I had to rearrange my own life. And when I needed her, when I asked for the smallest favor, I remember one winter evening when my heater broke down. The house was freezing, and I wrapped myself in blankets, shivering, my hands barely able to hold the phone as I dialed her number. She picked up, but instead of concern, I heard the edge in her voice. "I'm busy right now, Mom. Can you just call someone else to fix it?" I said, "Of course," and hung up before she could hear the hurt in my voice. That night, I boiled water and poured it into bottles to keep under my blankets for warmth. I told myself she didn't mean it. I told myself she was just overwhelmed. The visits grew fewer. The warmth in her voice faded. The laughter we used to share was gone. And yet, every time she came to me for help, I still opened the door, still cooked for her, still made sure she never felt the loneliness that was slowly becoming my constant companion. There was one particular moment that stayed with me. She had invited me over for a family lunch, something we hadn't done in a while. I was excited. I baked a pie early that morning to bring with me. But when I got there, she barely looked up from her phone to greet me. She set the pie on the counter without a word and went back to scrolling. During lunch, I tried to join the conversation, but every time I spoke, someone would change the subject or talk over me. I sat there, smiling politely, eating quietly, and wondering when my voice had stopped mattering. Still, I held on to hope. I thought maybe it was just a phase. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe her life was too full. I told myself over and over, "She's still my daughter. She loves me. She'll come around." But the truth was beginning to press in on me. Love without presence starts to feel like absence. The worst part wasn't the lack of help or the rare visits. It was the feeling that I was no longer someone she wanted in her life unless I was useful. I was becoming a tool, not a mother. And I didn't see it clearly until later, when that hospital bed would make the truth impossible to ignore. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when everything changed. I woke up feeling strange, not the kind of tired you get from a bad night's sleep, but a deep, heavy weakness that seemed to wrap around my bones. My chest felt tight, my head was spinning, and even getting out of bed took more effort than I had. I told myself it would pass, that I just needed some tea and rest. But by noon, my legs were trembling just from walking to the kitchen. I remember gripping the counter, trying to steady myself, when a sharp pain shot across my chest. It wasn't the dull ache I sometimes got from stress. This was sharper, deeper, and it made me gasp. I leaned on the counter, closing my eyes, hoping it would fade. But it didn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely reach for the phone. I thought about calling my daughter. For a second, I even started dialing her number, but something stopped me. I could already hear her voice in my head. "I'm busy right now, Mom." Can it wait? The thought made me hesitate. Instead, I called 911. The ambulance ride was a blur, flashing lights, a paramedic asking me questions I could barely answer, the cold smell of antiseptic in the air. They rushed me into the hospital, hooked me up to machines, and started running tests. A nurse leaned over me and asked, "Do you have any family we can contact?" I nodded and gave them my daughter's number. She wrote it down carefully, telling me someone would let her know. I believed her. That first night in the hospital, I lay there watching the door, expecting it to open at any moment. Every time footsteps passed, my heart lifted, only to sink again when they kept going. The nurse came back around 9 p.m., checking my IV, and I asked if my daughter had called. She shook her head and said, "Maybe she'll come in the morning." I smiled faintly, telling myself that must be it. The morning came, no call, no visit. Lunchtime passed, nothing. Every time the door opened for another patient's visitor, I looked up, hoping. I saw husbands bringing flowers, children carrying cards, friends with baskets of fruit. My table stayed empty. I told myself she was probably busy with the kids. Maybe she was waiting for a free afternoon to come. But the truth was harder to swallow with each passing hour. By the third day, even the nurses noticed. One of them, a kind, older woman, sat by my bed and asked softly, "Do you want me to try calling her again?" I shook my head. Pride kept me from saying yes. I didn't want her to come just because someone told her to. I wanted her to want to be there. On the fourth night, I overheard two visitors talking outside my room. One of them said, "Her daughter hasn't come once." That's awful. I pretended I didn't hear, but their words stuck to me like burrs. It was one thing for me to feel forgotten. It was another for strangers to see it too. I started wondering if maybe she didn't even know I was in the hospital. But that hope disappeared when one of the nurses told me she had called her the first day. She had been told I was fine and that she couldn't come right now. 6 days passed like that. 6 long days of staring at the same white ceiling, listening to the same beeping machines, and waiting for someone who never came. By the time I was stable enough to go home, something inside me had shifted forever. I wasn't just hurt. I wasn't just disappointed. I was done. Those 6 days felt like a lifetime. The hospital room became both my shelter and my prison. In the morning, sunlight would creep through the narrow blinds, making a pale stripe across my blanket. At night, the quiet would stretch so long that even the faint hum of the IV machine felt loud. Every day followed the same pattern: nurses coming in to check my vitals, doctors explaining my recovery plan, patients in nearby rooms laughing or crying with their visitors, and me just waiting. I tried not to count the hours, but I couldn't help it. By the end of the first day, I thought, maybe tomorrow. By the end of the second, I thought, she's probably waiting for the weekend. On the third day, hope began to feel like a heavy coat I didn't want to wear anymore. Other patients received flowers so bright they lit up the whole room. Some had homemade soup brought in by family. One man's daughter sat by his bed for hours, holding his hand while he slept. I watched all of this from my bed, pretending I didn't notice, but the truth was, I noticed everything. The empty space at the foot of my bed, the silence where a familiar voice should have been, the phone that never rang. Every time a nurse walked in with a smile, I half expected her to say, "Your daughter's here," but it never happened. Instead, they'd ask if I wanted them to call her again. I always said no. Pride, stubbornness, maybe a bit of self-respect. I told myself that if she wanted to see me, she would come on her own. On the fourth day, I overheard one of the nurses telling another that my daughter had been informed about my condition on the first day. She wasn't overseas. She wasn't in the middle of a crisis. She was home. She knew exactly where I was and chose not to come. That was the moment the truth stopped being something I could soften with excuses. By the fifth day, the waiting stopped hurting in the same way. It turned into something colder. My mind began replaying years of moments. Birthday parties I hosted for her children. Late nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays. Afternoons I gave her my last $20 so she could take the kids out. All of it felt different now, shaded by this silence. On the sixth day, I woke up and decided I would never beg for her presence again. The bond I thought was unbreakable had been tested, and it failed. Love doesn't just disappear, but trust does. And once trust is gone, it doesn't come back the same way. When the doctor told me I'd be discharged soon, I didn't think about calling her to pick me up. I thought about what I would do once I was back home, what changes I'd make, what boundaries I'd finally set. 6 days alone in that hospital didn't just heal my body, they cleared my mind. Lying there in that hospital bed, I made a promise to myself. This would be the last time I ever waited for her to show up. The last time I sat in silence, hoping she would choose me. My body was weak from the collapse, but my mind had never felt sharper. It was as if the quiet had stripped away every excuse I had been making for her for years. I could finally see her for who she had become, someone who saw me as an obligation, not as her mother. I thought about all the times I had told myself, she's just busy, or she'll come around. I realized that by protecting her from consequences, I had made it too easy for her to treat me this way. I had given her everything, my time, my energy, my love, my money, and she had learned to take it all without giving anything back. It wasn't just neglect, it was entitlement. From that bed, I began to think about everything she believed was hers for the taking. The house she called her future home when I passed. The savings she thought were tucked away for her children. The antiques I'd collected over the years that she'd already made space for in her mind. I knew every item, every account, every property. I also knew something she didn't. Legally, everything was still under my name. She might have spoken of them as hers, but the law said otherwise. I decided right then that she would not get the chance to inherit anything from me. Not after this. I didn't need to yell at her or demand an apology that would never come. My silence would be my answer, and my actions would speak louder than any confrontation. As I stared at the white hospital ceiling, I began mentally listing my assets: the lake house, the city apartment, the savings account, the investments, the jewelry, the furniture. I imagined each one slipping out of her reach. I imagined the shock on her face when she realized it was all gone, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt in control. The pain of being left alone in the hospital was still fresh, but underneath it, a new strength was building. I was going to take back what was mine, not to keep it all for myself, but to give it to people and places that would value it. Charities, friends who had stood by me, even distant relatives who had shown more kindness than my own daughter. The nurse came in to change my IV and asked if I wanted to call my daughter. I smiled and said, "No, thank you." That small moment felt like the first step toward freedom. I didn't owe her an update. I didn't owe her a chance to redeem herself. My trust had been tested and she had failed. Now I would act accordingly. The decision settled over me like a warm blanket. I would leave the hospital not just as a patient discharged, but as a woman reborn, a woman who finally knew her worth and would no longer hand it over to someone who couldn't see it. If there was one thing my daughter had always made clear, it was that the lake house was hers someday. She used to joke about it in front of friends and even strangers. "When Mom's gone, I'm moving into the lake house." She said it so casually, as if it were already a fact written in stone. She'd talk about how she would renovate it, what colors she'd paint the walls, how she'd host summer barbecues there, and every time she said it, she never once asked me how I felt about it. She never said, "If you want me to have it," or "if you decide." She spoke as though my death was a date on her calendar, and the house was the prize she'd collect. The lake house wasn't just a piece of property. It was the one place I had built with my own hands, not literally hammering the walls, but choosing every detail with care. After my husband died, I had saved for years to buy that place. It was meant to be a refuge. I picked it because of the quiet mornings, the sound of the water against the shore, the way the sunlight came through the windows in late afternoon. Every memory in that house was tied to peace, and yet, every time my daughter spoke about it, her words drained it of all meaning and turned it into a possession waiting to be claimed. What she didn't know, because she never cared to ask, was that years ago, I had quietly moved the property title back fully into my name after a failed attempt to transfer partial ownership. At the time, it was simply to keep my finances in order. Now, lying in that hospital bed, that decision felt like a shield I had unknowingly prepared for myself. She believed it was already hers. In reality, she had no legal right to it at all. The morning after I decided to take everything she expected away from her, I asked the nurse to bring me my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found my lawyer's number. When he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I want to sell the lake house," I told him. My voice was calm, steady. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He paused for a moment before asking if I was sure. "I've never been more sure," I replied. I told him I didn't want it listed publicly. I wanted a quick, quiet, private sale. No signs, no open houses, no gossip in town. Just paperwork, signatures, and a new owner as soon as possible. Over the next few days, between nurses checking my vitals and doctors making their rounds, I handled the sale from my hospital bed. My lawyer sent documents for me to sign electronically. He lined up a buyer who had been looking for a waterfront property for months. Everything moved faster than I expected, as if the universe was determined to help me close this chapter. I never told my daughter, not a word. Let her go on dreaming about her summers at the lake, her imagined parties on the deck. Let her feel secure in her assumption that one day she'd just walk in and claim it as hers. The reality would hit her like ice water soon enough, not from me telling her, but from the finality of a deed with someone else's name on it. In a way, selling the lake house wasn't just about taking something from her, it was about reclaiming it for myself in my final years, not to live in, but to use the money for something that mattered to me. I planned to give some to charities I cared about, some to people who had truly been there for me when I needed them, and some simply to make my own life easier. I wanted to travel a little, see the places I had only read about. I wanted to buy things without wondering if I should save them for her. By the end of the week, the sale was done. The money was in my account. The keys were no longer mine, and neither was the burden of knowing she was just waiting for me to die so she could step into my life like it was an inheritance game. The lake house was gone, but so was the hold she had over me. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel guilt. All I felt was freedom. The quiet, undeniable freedom of knowing I had taken back control of my own story. The lake house sale was only the beginning. That decision had lit something inside me, not anger, not spite, but a kind of cold clarity I had never felt before. I realized that everything my daughter thought she was entitled to, every asset she believed would one day be hers, was still mine. It was all under my control, and for the first time in years, I wasn't going to make decisions based on her expectations. I was going to make them based on who actually deserved what I had worked for. That night, as the hospital room fell quiet and the hallway lights dimmed, I reached for my notebook from the drawer beside my bed. I began to list everything I owned: the savings account, the investments, the jewelry, the antiques, the little things my husband and I had collected over a lifetime together. Seeing it all written out, page after page, was a reminder of how much I had built from nothing. And then another truth hit me. Most of the people who had been there in my hardest moments were not the people who would get a cent if I left my will as it was. My current will, written years ago when I still believed my daughter would always be my anchor, left almost everything to her. Back then, it made sense. She was my only child, the only direct bloodline left after my husband's passing. But now, that thought didn't bring me comfort. It brought me a dull ache in my chest. I thought about how she had left me in the hospital for 6 days without a single visit, without even a short phone call to check on me. I thought about the years of small dismissals and cold words that had slowly chipped away at the bond we once had. The next morning, I called my lawyer again. This time, my voice was sharper, more resolved. "I want to change my will," I said. "I want her removed entirely." There was a pause, then a slow, understanding, "all right," on the other end. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't need one. He had seen the disappointment in my eyes during the lake house sale. He knew this wasn't a decision I had made lightly. We went through the details together. I decided that the bulk of my estate would go to 3 charities that had real meaning to me. One for widows living alone, one for children in foster care, and one for a small animal rescue I had supported for years. I left a portion to 2 distant cousins who had always made the effort to visit, send cards, and call on holidays. And for the personal things, the antique tea set from my mother, the gold watch my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary, I chose friends who would treasure them, not sell them. As for my daughter, her name would not appear anywhere in the new will, not even for a token amount. I didn't want her to receive a single dollar or item simply because she shared my blood. I wanted there to be no confusion when the day came. She would know, without question, that she had been intentionally left out. When the lawyer brought the new documents to the hospital for me to sign, I felt an unexpected lightness. Each signature was like cutting another rope that had been holding me down. I wasn't doing this to be cruel. I was doing it to make sure the years I had left, and the years after I was gone, reflected the truth. Love and loyalty are not guaranteed by family titles. Before he left, my lawyer hesitated at the door. "Are you sure you don't want to leave a letter explaining why?" he asked. I shook my head. "She'll know why," I said, "and the silence will say more than any letter ever could." When he was gone, I sat back against the pillows and let out a long breath. The will was changed. The lake house was sold. Piece by piece, I was taking back what had been taken for granted for far too long. On the 7th morning, a nurse came into my room with a smile and said, "You're going home today." I looked around at the hospital bed, the thin blanket, the little table covered in empty water cups and tea bags. It wasn't a warm place, but it had given me time to think, time to decide. In those 6 days without a single visit, I had done more than just recover from my illness. I had recovered from years of believing my daughter would always be there for me. As I packed the few belongings I had brought, my robe, my slippers, my worn paperback, I heard the phone ring at the nurse's station. A minute later, the nurse popped her head in. "It's your daughter," she said. For a second, my hands froze. Part of me wondered if she had finally realized how long it had been. Maybe she was calling to say she was coming to get me. Maybe there would be an apology. But when I picked up the phone, her voice was flat, rushed. "So, are you feeling better yet?" "No, I'm sorry." "No, I missed you." Just that one question, as if she were checking a box. "Yes," I said simply. My tone gave her nothing. She paused for a second, maybe expecting more, but I stayed quiet. We said goodbye, and that was the end of it. A hospital orderly wheeled me to the front doors, the sunlight sharp after days under fluorescent bulbs. I stepped out, feeling the cold air hit my face. My ride, arranged by my lawyer, was waiting. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back at the hospital. I didn't think about my daughter waiting at home, because I knew she wasn't. I thought about the quiet cottage by the sea that was waiting for me instead, the one I had already chosen as my next chapter. The drive was long, and the silence inside the car gave me space to reflect. I wasn't angry in that moment. I wasn't even sad. I just felt empty, but in a way that was almost peaceful. I had let go of expecting her to be someone she was not. That freedom, I realized, was worth more than any apology she could give. When I reached my lawyer's office, I signed the final documents confirming the sale of the lake house and the new will. He asked if I wanted him to send her a copy now or wait. I told him to wait. Let her think nothing had changed. Let her live in that illusion until the day it all came crashing down. I left his office with no keys to the lake house, no ties to the life I had built around her. All I carried was a small envelope with the deed to my new cottage and the contact information for the charities that would one day inherit what I had left. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was mine again. I went home that evening to a house that was already half empty. I had been selling things slowly, quietly, over the past year. The walls didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore, and that was fine. Soon, I'd be gone from here too. The morning the sale closed, the sky was clear and sharp, the kind of blue that makes everything feel final. The young couple buying the lake house had fallen in love with it the moment they saw it. I could see why. The water shimmered against the sunlight, the old oak trees swayed in the breeze, and the wraparound porch looked like it had been built for slow summer evenings. It was beautiful, but it no longer felt like mine. I stood in the living room for a while before the papers were signed. The sunlight poured through the big windows, catching the dust in the air. Every corner held a memory: birthdays, quiet mornings with coffee, my daughter running barefoot across the floor when she was small. But I didn't let myself stay in those thoughts for long. The house had been a dream once, but dreams can become cages when they're built around people who stop caring. The lawyer arrived with the final documents. His voice was calm as he walked me through each page, his pen tapping the spots where I needed to sign. My hands didn't shake. Every stroke of the pen felt like removing another chain from my life. By noon, it was done. The couple arrived with wide smiles, holding hands like they were stepping into their future. I greeted them warmly, told them to take care of the place, and handed them the keys. They didn't know the story behind the sale. To them, it was just a lucky find. That was fine with me. Not every truth needs to be spoken aloud. It wasn't until a week later that the phone call came. My daughter's voice was sharp, almost frantic. "The lake house? You sold the lake house?" I could hear the disbelief, the rising anger. "Why would you do that without telling me?" I didn't rush to answer. I let the silence stretch just enough for her to feel it. Then I spoke, slowly, clearly. "You left me alone in the hospital for 6 days. Not once did you come. That house was what you wanted most. Now you'll have to live without it, just like I had to live without you." She sputtered something about misunderstandings, about being busy, about not knowing how bad it was. But I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply said, "Goodbye," and hung up. For the rest of the day, the phone rang again and again. I didn't answer. She could call as much as she wanted, but she couldn't undo the choice she made when she stayed away. Some lessons can't be softened. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, looking over the paperwork for my new cottage. The lake house was gone, and with it, the weight of all the years I had waited for my daughter to be the person I needed her to be. I felt lighter, freer. I realized I hadn't just sold her dream home. I had sold the last piece of leverage she held over my heart. The cottage I chose was nothing like the grand lake house my daughter once dreamed of. It sat quietly by the sea, a little weathered from years of salt and wind, with white shutters that creaked when the breeze came through. The front porch was small, but it faced the water. In the mornings, I could sit there with a blanket on my lap, holding a warm mug, and listen to the waves folding into the shore. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. The first weekend I moved in, I unpacked only the things that mattered. A few photo albums, the quilt I had sewn when my daughter was a baby, a small set of dishes, and my books. I didn't need the heavy furniture, the crystal glasses, or the antique cabinets. I left those behind when I walked away from the lake house. I was building a different life now, one without constant reminders of who didn't show up for me when it mattered most. Here, the days were slow in the best way. In the mornings, I'd watch the fishermen head out with their boats, tiny specks on the horizon. By midday, I'd walk into the small town market, where the shopkeepers greeted me by name. Nobody here knew my story unless I told it. They didn't see me as a burden or an obligation, just a woman starting fresh. At night, I'd light a single candle on my table and eat simple meals: grilled fish, fresh bread, vegetables from the market. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel forgotten. The quiet felt like a friend. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to call or visit or remember me. My daughter stopped calling after the house sale. I think she realized there was nothing left to argue over. I didn't block her number. I didn't have to. The silence between us had already spoken louder than any words could. Sometimes when I sit by the shore and watch the tide come in, I think about how quickly life can shift. One week you're lying in a hospital bed, hoping the people you love will walk through the door. The next, you're watching the sunset in a place they'll never find you. I don't carry anger with me now. I've learned that anger keeps you tied to the very people who hurt you. Instead, I carry distance. I carry choice. I carry my own life and no one else's expectations. If anyone asks me about my family, I just say, they're living their lives and I'm living mine. And it's true. I don't wish her harm. I don't wish her well either. I wish her nothing, and that's its own kind of freedom. A burden is only heavy if you keep carrying it. I set mine down on the day I walked out of that hospital, and every wave that hits the shore outside my little cottage reminds me I will never pick it up again.